briefly on simpler things. For example, our democracy assistance programs that IFES and others are involved in. It seems to me that in these countries, and in Egypt in particular, there is a need to, in a gentle, diplomatic, non-neocolonial way, educate them on best practices and international standards, on elections and a lot of other things. Some of these countries have been really quite isolated, and they don't really know how things are being done elsewhere in the world, and there's a need to engage, and it's it's difficult, and I think that IFES and other organizations and the U.S. government and USAID are encountering some problems in trying to educate people in these countries in the hopes that they will develop their own systems in the best way possible going forward. I want to say just a couple of brief points about the other cases. I spoke a lot about what we should do with the countries that are already on the road to transition. What about those that are not? In the very difficult cases that I mentioned, Libya, Syria, and the others, look, these are very difficult cases. Formulating our policies is going to be very difficult. And I think that we need to just try to find ways, on the part of the United States and Europe as well, try to find ways to make clear what we stand for, without trying to shift the conflict from one between the citizens and the government to one between our governments and their governments, right? We don't want to take the whole burden on our shoulders, but at the same time, we need to continue to find ways to make very clear what we stand for. And it's really difficult in certain cases, and Bahrain is a particularly difficult one, where we have some very important allies, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, standing on the other side and recommending just the opposite of what we are recommending. And then regarding the last set, regarding the cases that we think are easy, let's say Morocco and Jordan, I would say that this is, they're deceptive cases, I think, in a way. I'm seeing already emerge, I think, a tendency to sort of shower Morocco and Jordan with praise and give the governments, I think, even more credit than they deserve for what they are doing, because frankly, and I see this a lot on U.S. officials, they're just so relieved. Oh my God, we have problems with so many countries in the region. We can just, not worry about Morocco and Jordan. Their kings are going to carry out reform. We can just pat them on the back and not worry about them. I think we should perhaps play it a little bit cooler, because I fear we could be repeating old mistakes. I mean, let's see how things go in Morocco and Jordan. We really need to be watching is the populations in those countries, civil society and politicians and so forth, and are they happy with what's going on or not? Because as I hear all this praise, particularly for Morocco these days, I can't help but think back to a few years ago when we were all heaping praise on Egypt for its economic reforms. And those words, I think, have come back to haunt us all a few years later. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank all three panelists for a superb job of setting the stage for what will be a lively discussion. First of all, we're moving a microphone to the center. As all of you may know, we are live webcasting this. So if you have questions, please go to the microphone and identify yourself so that the people watching this on the web are going to know and hear your questions. Using the prerogative of the moderator as people formulate their questions, I'm going to ask a simple question about patience. We are dealing with a number of very proud countries with strong senses of identity and nationalism. Whatever change takes place within their country, hopefully through the ballot box, is going to be free, fair, credible, transparent, equal to world standards. But that means that each election process is going to be relatively unique, and each one has to take place in a way that is credible both to the voters in those societies as well as to the losers in the political contest, because the challenge of an election is not if the results are accepted only by the winners, but are also accepted by the losers in society at large. Now that patience also runs in parallel with the great economic problems that each of these societies is currently experiencing. So my question to each of the panelists to start off with is how much patience, how much time do you think we all have to try and work with our partners in Tunisia and Egypt and Jordan and around the entire region to put in place a fair election process that is meaningful to the citizens but also meets their desires for great economic and societal change? That, I'll give you each 30 seconds to answer. I'm kidding. Amber?
Well, I guess you could argue that in some of the countries, is this on? That in some of the countries, well, in Egypt in particular, that patience is starting to run slightly low, as we've seen in recent protests in the last few weeks. At the same time, I think what the governments would behoove them to do is to actually increase their dialogue with civil society. There, as I mentioned earlier, there are legitimate changes for why some things have been taking a little bit longer. But at the same time, this has not been conveyed very clearly to the citizenry. And I think if this doesn't happen, they will lose patience sooner rather than later. I was quite surprised actually at how little that the Tunisians were actually quite patient when the elections were moved back to October from July, in comparison to what I thought might happen. But at the same time, unlike what was actually said earlier, which was that they were going to be included in the national dialogue, they have not been included. And if this continues, I think that the patience will be wearing fairly thin. We've heard in Egypt potentially that the elections are going to be also pushed back by a couple months. There's talk in the last few days that the election processes will be starting in September rather than the elections actually happening in September. Now, if the government wants to keep people's patience, especially considering the recent protests that have taken place, they need to make sure that their communication strategies are quite strong in conveying to the public what's going on.
Mr. Brok?
No, I think that this unrest is there because there's the feeling that there are still too many people from the old system there. Mm-hmm. That is the classical point, how you can bring patience to revolutions. That was always a difficult point of view, but on the other side, it's the only way to do so. We had to learn that if you want to transform a country, you have to use a lot of people from the old system. Because only many of them in the middle level of administration have the experience on how to run it. It's not a question to change totally the personnel, it's the question how to create new loyalties. And here to make the young people on the streets aware of that and a compromise, I think it's a very difficult point, and therefore I think it must be led to a feeling that if there is a delay of the election, which I think it's a good chance that this is used for setting up real election campaigns for a change and have to build up parties. Therefore, to a delay is a chance. Not a delay will be satisfaction at the time because it will be around the army something, or it will be the Muslims Brotherhood, or a mixture of it, which will not be the result we would like to have. And here I talked about Egypt, and I think we have to see that. And I do not agree with you that it's this trade on this question is a long-term perspective. No, you need a long-term perspective. I agree with you, it needs a long time to get the results. But without a perspective given now that there will be the structural changes for the better, also in economic and social policy, you will not get the fantasy of the people to go for that. If we take that for later, it will never happen. And we have a lot of experience. For example, even in Europe, we were just a bit before my eyes. The countries who did after 1989 very fast the structural changes were successful. The countries who were 10 years behind, like Romania and Bulgaria, are still there. Because even the new system, the new system is on the umbrella, but the old structures can go forward without that change and these new loyalties. Then you will not get rid of them later. And then you have this old festival of corruption and all that. which will not help us. But I think, therefore, it must be the broad picture, and put in that picture a clear campaign possibilities that there is a real battle for the vote and a fair chance for everyone, for every group set up.
Michelle, you've got
Yeah.
a number of questions.
Right. Well, let me clarify what I meant about long-term. I certainly didn't mean that reforms should wait long-term. I was talking specifically about trade within the region, trade within the Middle East or within North Africa being the answer to their economic problems. I would say that could only be the case in the long term. In the short term, I'll be very frank with you. When I hear the U.S. and Europe talking about encouraging trade within the region, I suspect the U.S. and Europe are trying to avoid hard decisions about trade with the region. That's my concern, because I think, I don't know about on the European side, certainly on the American side, the policy dustbin is littered with failed initiatives to encourage trade within the region. So it's just something we need to keep in mind. That's the only thing I meant about something that could work out in the long term, but I don't see it as a short-term spur to their economies. Regarding the elections, Bill, I couldn't agree with you more about the concern about elections that are credible and are accepted by those who lose as well as those who win. I'm particularly concerned about that in Egypt. I share your concerns, Mr. Brok, about the electoral results. I mean, who would win elections in Egypt if they're held too soon? But even before that, I'm concerned about Egyptian electoral authorities being able to administer the elections in a way that will be credible enough so that everyone accepts the results. So, I think it would be a good idea if they do postpone them a bit. The other thing that we have to remember, I think, is that in these countries, in Tunisia and Egypt, we're not just talking about one set of elections. We're talking about quite a few elections over the next couple of years. I mean, in Egypt, for example, parliamentary elections, let's say October or November, the choice of some sort of constituent assembly, a presidential election, the writing of a new constitution, then a referendum on that constitution. And if there are significant changes to the constitution, which are likely, maybe we start all over again with all new parliamentary elections, presidential elections, etc. So we don't have to worry just about people being patient with one election, but with ongoing, quite a few elections, I would guess, over the next few years. And that's where my concern about the economy comes in. The Egyptian government recently sort of averted a budget crisis, but they could easily face one again. Hyperinflation and this kind of a disastrous economic crisis, which of course, say a year from now, that could make people lose patience with elections and the political process. And that's even outside how well or poorly elections are run. Just briefly on Jordan. Look, I think that, Jordan has made tremendous improvements to the running of elections. I myself was an election observer in Jordan. It was an impressive process. The problem in Jordan is elections for what? Elections for a parliament that has no power. That's why they can't, incentivize the creation of real political parties and real political competition and so forth. Everyone sees clearly that this is a competition over very, very little. Now, the constitutional reforms in Morocco, I will give them credit that they at least begin to touch on that question of the power of the elected institutions as opposed to the power of the monarchy. They certainly don't resolve that question, but at least they address that question.
Okay, if people have questions, if you'd go to the mic and identify yourself, that would be very helpful. Please, the mic is right behind you, sir. And why don't you get right in line behind him? Now we have feedback, so we've proved it's on. For those on the web, we are now changing the mic so that instead of listening to feedback, you actually get the question. This is part of the dynamic of new technology, that Twitter thing that Elmar was referring to earlier. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. How we doing? Why don't you use my mic? I'm not selfish.